Welcome to Nonfiction Insights. So today we're going to dive deep into outliers, break down those big ideas that Gladwell presents, take a close look at the evidence, and, try to figure out what it all means.
Because Gladwell kind of flips the script, doesn't he? I mean, he argues that things like hidden advantages, the cultures we come from, even just good old-fashioned luck, they actually play a bigger role in success than we might think.
All right, let's jump right in with something that Gladwell calls the Roseto mystery. It's how he starts the book, and it's a really captivating story. So can you set the scene for us? What's Roseto all about?
Okay, so picture this. It's the late 1950s, and we're in a small town in Pennsylvania, right? Roseto. It was founded by Italian immigrants, specifically from a town called Roseto Valfratore, and they brought a whole lot of their traditions with them.
Like what kind of traditions?
Well, they were all about family, community, that old world Italian way of life. Everyone knew everyone. They were always socializing, huge extended families, all living together.
Sounds idyllic in a way.
It was in a lot of ways. But here's where it gets interesting. A doctor named Stuart Wolfe, he was doing some research, and he stumbled upon something remarkable in Roseto.
What did he find?
The people in Roseto, they had incredibly low rates of heart disease, way lower than the surrounding towns like Bangor and Nazareth, even though they weren't exactly health nuts. I mean, their diets weren't all that different. They weren't exercising any more than anyone else.
So it wasn't like they had some secret Mediterranean diet or anything like that?
Nope, not at all. And that's what made it such a mystery. Wolf, he was really thorough. He studied their lifestyles, medical histories, everything. And he just couldn't figure it out at first.
So what was the answer? What was protecting the Rosetons from heart disease?
Well, Wolf eventually realized that it wasn't about any individual thing they were doing. It was the community itself.
The community.
Yeah, those strong social bonds, that constant interaction, the respect for elders, the fact that people weren't obsessed with climbing the ladder and getting ahead, all of that, it created this protective bubble against stress.
Wow. So it's like the community was a kind of social immune system.
Exactly. And that really makes you think, right, about how our social environment can have such a profound impact on our well-being. I mean, think about your own life. What kind of community are you part of? How supportive is it?
That's a great question to ponder. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about another big idea from Outliers, the 10,000-hour rule. Now, this one gets thrown around a lot, but can you break it down for us?
Sure. Basically, the 10,000-hour rule says that if you want to become truly great at something, like reach a level of mastery, you need to put in about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice.
10,000 hours? That's like a really specific number. Where does that come from?
Gladwell got it from a psychologist named K. Anders Ericsson. Ericsson did this study with violinists at an elite music academy in Berlin, and what he found was that by the time they reached 20 years old, the very best violinists had all practiced for about, you guessed it, 10,000 hours.
Wow, that's a lot of practicing.
It is. And here's the kicker. Ericsson didn't find any naturals, people who just sailed to the top without putting in the work. It seems like everyone who reaches that level of mastery has put in a similar amount of dedicated practice.
So you're saying talent alone doesn't cut it?
Right. Talent might give you a head start, but to really excel, you've got to put in the hours. And Gladwell illustrates this with some really cool examples.
Like the Beatles,
Yeah.
right? Their time in Hamburg.
Yeah. Those early days, they were playing 8 hours a night, 7 days a week, sometimes even twice a day. They did something like 1,200 live performances in just a couple of years.
That's insane.
Right, and that's how they became the Beatles. All those hours on stage, honing their skills, developing their sound, it transformed them.
Talk about deliberate practice. And then there's Bill Gates, right? He kind of had the perfect storm of opportunity and dedication.
Totally. I mean, think about it. He went to this fancy private school, Lakeside, and they actually had a computer club back in the 60s, which was practically unheard of. And thanks to the Mothers Club, they had access to this, state-of-the-art computer.
So Gates was able to get his hands on computers when most people didn't even know what they were.
Exactly. And he was obsessed. He spent every free moment programming, late nights, weekends, all of it. And then when he went to the University of Washington, he had even more access to computers. He was putting in crazy hours way before anyone even knew who he was.
It sounds like his success was a combination of being super passionate about programming and having the opportunity to really immerse himself in it.
Absolutely. And then there's another Bill Joy, who co-founded Sun Microsystems. He had a similar story. When he went to the University of Michigan, they had this amazing computer lab, one of the most advanced in the country at the time. And Joy, he basically lived in that lab. He was coding all night, every night.
It sounds like a pattern is emerging here.
Yeah, I mean, you can be talented, you can be driven, but to truly achieve outlier status, you often need those opportunities, those lucky breaks that allow you to put in the hours and really hone your craft. So thinking about your own goals, are you creating those opportunities for yourself? Are you putting in those hours of deliberate practice?
That's something for us all to consider. All right, now for something completely different and maybe a little controversial, Gladwell's argument about birth dates.
Ah, yes. This one is a real head-scratcher at first. He uses the example of Canadian hockey to illustrate this.
Right, so explain that for us. How can your birthday influence your success in hockey?
Well, in Canadian youth hockey, the cutoff date for age groups is January 1st. So if you're born in January, you're automatically going to be older and often bigger and stronger than someone born in December of the same year, even though they're technically in the same age group.
And those few months can make a big difference, especially when you're young.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Coaches, they tend to favor the bigger, more mature kids. They see them as being more talented, even if it's just because they're older. So those January-born kids, they get more attention, better coaching, they get put on the better teams, they get more ice time, and that initial advantage, it just snowballs over time.
So it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Yeah. Right. Gladwell calls it the Matthew effect. The rich get richer, basically. And to really hammer this point home, he has this funny bit where he reimagines a play-by-play of a championship game, but instead of player names, he uses their birth months. And it's like, January scores, March with the assist, February makes a great save. It's kind of absurd, but it highlights just how prevalent this birth date bias can be.
And it's not just hockey either, is it?
Nope. Similar patterns have been found in soccer, in baseball, even in academics. Those kids born earlier in the cutoff year, they just tend to have a leg up.
Which means a lot of talent is probably being overlooked simply because of when someone was born.
Exactly. It's kind of unfair when you think about it. So, it's worth considering, are there any similar cutoff dates in your field? Are there ways that this kind of bias might be playing out?
Interesting question. Okay, let's move on to another challenging idea. The limitations of intelligence. Gladwell kicks this off by introducing us to Christopher Langan, who's considered to have an incredibly high IQ.
Yeah, Langan's IQ is off the charts. He's like the self-taught genius. He's read tons of books. He can speak multiple languages. But Gladwell uses him to illustrate a point about what IQ can and cannot do for you.
And this contrasts with another famous study about intelligence, right? Lewis Terman's work with gifted kids, the termites.
Right. Back in the 1920s, Terman identified a bunch of kids with exceptionally high IQs, like over 140, and he followed them throughout their lives, thinking they were all going to become, world-changing geniuses.
But that didn't really happen, did it?
Not exactly. A lot of them did well, they had good careers, stable lives, but as a group, they didn't achieve those outsized levels of success that you might expect based on their IQs.
So it's like there's a point where having a higher IQ doesn't really translate to greater success in the real world.
Right. Gladwell makes this analogy to height in basketball. You have to be tall enough to play in the NBA, but being even taller doesn't automatically make you a superstar. There's a threshold. And Gladwell argues that the same thing applies to intelligence.
And he uses some interesting research to back this up, right? Like Liam Hudson's work and the fact that Nobel Prize winners come from all sorts of backgrounds.
Yeah, Hudson did these divergence tests where he asked people to come up with creative uses for everyday objects. And he found that people with super high IQs, they're often pretty practical, but not that imaginative. But people with slightly lower IQs, they sometimes came up with more creative ideas.
So it's like creativity and problem-solving skills are just as important as raw intelligence.
Absolutely. And when you look at Nobel Prize winners, you find that they didn't all go to Harvard or MIT, that they came from all sorts of schools. So a good education matters, but it's not the only factor.
It sounds like there's a whole lot more to success than just being really smart.
Definitely. And a sociologist named Sorokin, he actually argued that if Terman had just picked a random group of kids from similar backgrounds as the termites, they probably would have achieved almost as much, even without those sky-high IQs. So it makes you wonder, are we overemphasizing intelligence? Are we missing out on other important qualities that contribute to success?
That's something to think about. All right, let's move on to social savvy and concerted cultivation. This is where Gladwell compares Christopher Langan to Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project.
Right. So both of these guys were incredibly brilliant, But they had very different outcomes in life. Langan, he struggled to navigate the academic world. He even lost his scholarship at Reed College. But Oppenheimer, he thrived in those same environments. He was able to get people to listen to him, to trust him, even though he was working on this incredibly complex and secretive project.
And Gladwell attributes this difference to their upbringings.
Yeah, he draws on the work of sociologist Annette Leroux, who studied different parenting styles. And she found that middle-class and wealthier parents often engage in what she calls concerted cultivation.
Concerted cultivation. What does that mean?
It means they're very actively involved in their kids' lives. They enroll them in tons of extracurriculars. They reason with them. They encourage them to question authority. They advocate for them at school. Basically, they're giving their kids this, like, toolkit for navigating the world and getting what they want.
So it's a very hands-on approach to parenting.
Right. And it contrasts with the accomplishment of natural growth style that's more common in working class families, where kids are given more freedom and independence.
And Gladwell argues that Langan lacked that concerted cultivation, right?
Exactly. He kind of grew up on his own intellectually, and he never really developed those social skills, that ability to persuade and navigate complex social situations.
So even though he was brilliant, he couldn't really leverage his intelligence effectively.
Right. He couldn't translate his ideas into real-world success. And Gladwell gives this great example of a kid named Alex who was raised with concerted cultivation. Alex is at the doctor, and he actually interrupts the doctor to correct him about his own age.
He corrects the doctor.
Yeah. And it seems like a small thing, but it shows how comfortable he is with speaking up, with interacting with authority figures. It's a skill that Langan never really developed. So it really makes you think about how our upbringing can shape our social intelligence and our ability to navigate the world.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about the power of opportunity and cultural legacies, using the story of Joe Flom.
Flom, he was this lawyer who became super successful, kind of a legend in the legal world, but his story starts in, pretty humble circumstances.
Tell us about it.
So he was the son of Jewish immigrants, grew up in New York during the Depression, not exactly a recipe for success, right?
Right.
But here's the thing. He faced all this discrimination. The big prestigious law firms wouldn't hire Jewish lawyers back then. So Flom, he ended up working in this small, scrappy firm that took on the cases nobody else wanted, like corporate takeovers, which were seen as kind of messy and unpleasant at the time.
But those corporate takeovers, they became a big deal later on, right?
Huge. And Flom, with his years of experience in this niche area, he was suddenly the guy everyone wanted to hire. It was like he'd been training for this specific moment without even realizing it.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
Right. And Gladwell points out that Flom's generation, they also benefited from what he calls demographic luck. They were born during a dip in the birth rate, so there was less competition for jobs and opportunities.
So it wasn't just about Flom's individual talents and hard work. There were these larger social and economic forces at play.
Totally. And then there's the whole cultural legacy thing. Gladwell talks about how Jewish immigrants in New York, a lot of them worked in the garment industry, and they had this culture of hard work, of making deals, of being entrepreneurial. And those skills, they proved incredibly valuable in the world of corporate law.
So Flom's success was, in a way, built on the struggles and triumphs of his immigrant community.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how our backgrounds can shape our opportunities in unexpected ways. And it makes you wonder what seemingly insignificant parts of your own background might actually be your hidden advantages.
Great question. All right, let's talk about cultural influences on behavior, using the case study of Korean Air.
This is a pretty sobering example. Back in the late 20th century, Korean Air had a really bad track record when it came to plane crashes.
They have a lot of accidents.
Way too many. And it wasn't just bad luck. When they started investigating, they found all sorts of problems with pilot training, communication, and the overall culture within the airline.
Gladwell talks about this idea of mitigated speech in the context of the Korean air crashes. Can you explain that?
Sure. So mitigated speech is basically when you use indirect or deferential language, especially when talking to someone in a position of authority. And Gladwell uses the example of Avianca Flight 052, which ran out of fuel and crashed near JFK. The first officer, he kept hinting that they were low on fuel, but he was so indirect about it that the air traffic controller didn't grasp the urgency of the situation.
It's like he was being too polite or maybe too afraid to directly challenge the captain?
Right. And this ties into Geert Hofstede's work on cultural dimensions, specifically power distance. South Korea has a very high power distance culture, meaning there's a strong emphasis on hierarchy and respect for authority.
And how did that play out in the Korean air cockpits?
Well, it created this environment where junior pilots were incredibly hesitant to question or contradict their captains, even if they saw something wrong. They were afraid of being disrespectful, of causing a loss of face.
Wow. So the cultural norms were actually working against safety.
Exactly, and it led to some tragic outcomes. But here's the interesting part. Korean Air, they eventually turned things around. They brought in a new CEO, David Greenberg, and he implemented some major changes.
What kind of changes?
Well, one big thing was language. He made English the official language in the cockpit.
Why English?
Because English is a more neutral language, it doesn't have the same built-in hierarchy as Korean. So by speaking English, pilots could communicate more directly and assertively, regardless of their rank.
That's fascinating. So they used language as a tool to change the culture.
Exactly, and it worked. Korean Air's safety record improved dramatically. It's a powerful example of how cultural norms can have a huge impact, and how, with conscious effort, those norms can be shifted.
It's a great reminder to be aware of the cultural dynamics at play in our own lives and workplaces. All right, let's move on to our final big idea, the power of persistence and meaningful work. Gladwell starts this section by talking about rice paddies.
Rice paddies, yeah. It's a bit of a left turn, but it all ties together. He contrasts Western agriculture, which is very mechanized, with rice farming in Asia, which is incredibly labor-intensive.
So what's the point of that comparison?
Well, rice farming, it requires this incredible level of dedication and attention to detail. You're constantly working, constantly making small adjustments. And Gladwell argues that this has shaped the cultural values of many Asian societies, instilling a strong work ethic and a focus on persistence.
And he connects this to the fact that Asian students tend to outperform Western students in math.
Right. For a long time, people tried to explain this by saying that Asians were just naturally better at math, but Gladwell debunks that myth.
So what's the real explanation?
Well, researchers like Karen Cusin have found that Asian number systems are actually more logical and transparent than Western number systems, particularly when it comes to fractions. So Asian kids are basically starting with a slight advantage.
Sounds like they have a better foundation.
Exactly. And then there's this whole cultural legacy of hard work and persistence that comes from the rice paddy tradition. So when Asian kids encounter a difficult math problem, they're more likely to stick with it, to keep trying until they figure it out.
And Gladwell ties this to the work of Alan Schoenfeld, who studied problem solving.
Yeah, Schoenfeld noticed that Western students, they tend to give up pretty easily when faced with a tough math problem. But he also found that with the right guidance and encouragement, they could learn to persevere.
So it's not that Western kids are inherently bad at math. They just need to develop that stick-with-itness.
Right. And that's where the KPP schools come in.
KPP.
Yeah. Knowledge is Power program. There are these charter schools in underprivileged areas, and they have this incredibly rigorous program. Long school days, Saturday classes, tons of homework. They're basically trying to instill that rice paddy work ethic in their students.
And how's it working?
Really well, actually. KPP students are graduating high school and going to college at much higher rates than kids from similar backgrounds. And Gladwell uses the story of Marita, a KPP student, to really bring this to life. She's working incredibly hard, making sacrifices, but she's also thriving.
It's a powerful example of how opportunity and effort can really make a difference.
Absolutely. And it all comes back to Gladwell's main point. Outliers, those extraordinary successes, they're not just born that way. They're shaped by a whole constellation of factors, many of which are outside their control. It's about opportunity, it's about cultural legacies, it's about being willing to put in the hard work, and yeah, it's even about a little bit of luck.
And Gladwell ends the book on a personal note with the story of his own grandmother in Jamaica.
Yeah, Daisy Nation. And he actually corrects the record a bit. He initially describes her as being known for her beauty, but then he reveals that she was this incredibly strong and resourceful woman who fought to give her daughters a good education, even though they faced a lot of obstacles because of their race and social status.
So his own family history is a testament to the themes he explores in the book.
Exactly. It all comes full circle.
So as we've seen, the story of success is a lot more complex and interesting than we might think. It's not just about individual talent and drive. It's about all these external factors that shape our opportunities and our paths. As you go about your day, think about those hidden advantages you might have, those cultural legacies you've inherited. Think about those opportunities that might be right in front of you, just waiting to be seized.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Outliers.
And don't forget to subscribe to Nonfiction Insights for more explorations of fascinating books and ideas.